Kingsley Plantation is a plantation in northern Florida that has been kept in pristine condition over the years. It's located on Fort George Island, which is a barrier island close to Fernandina and Amelia Island. Fernandina Beach was a trading hub during the period that Kingsley Plantation was active. So a lot of slaves came in through there and a lot of crops were exported. The area is very marshy and the plantation itself is located on a river. It's very hot and humid in this area, swampy, and so it was used for planting crops that are local to hot areas like indigo, Sea Island cotton, and the slaves could grow their own food there, like okra, potatoes, and they could fish on the river. Zephaniah Kingsley was a British slave trader who made his money in buying and selling slaves and selling cash crops like corn and cotton. He moved to Kingsley Plantation in 1814 and brought his wife and children. His wife, Anna, was famous because she was actually a former slave herself who he had bought and then married. She was from Senegal, West Africa, and helped to keep control over the plantation and manage the slaves and basically ran the plantation. So a big question with Zephaniah Kingsley's wife being of African descent is how did he treat his slaves? And based on what we know of him, it doesn't seem like he was horrifically cruel to them. I mean, you can't disregard the fact that these people were illegally taken and forced to work, but there were certain things like he let them keep their names rather than forcing them to take Anglo-style names, which was atypical for a slaveholder at the time. He also let the people work under a task system, which meant that they had a specific amount of work for the day, and then they could theoretically rest for the rest of the day once they finished their task. So this allowed for the people to have the slaves working on the plantation to have time to themselves and time to raise children and have a family. He also was an advocate for black rights and believed that black men should be able to be free and lead their own lives, and got upset when people didn't listen to him for this and disregarded the views. So the slave houses on Kingsley Plantation were pretty unique to a plantation in America. There were about 32 houses, but some of them were destroyed later. Many are not completely intact anymore. There would be anywhere from 60 to 80 slaves living on site. These houses were made of tabby, which was a combination of oyster shells and water, which is very typical of Florida architecture, similar to coquina. The slaves lived there and basically did their whole livelihood here. They had yards that were very important to them where they would sit and talk and basically maintain their African culture. And these slave houses were built very close to the main house, which is typical of the African influence on the plantation, which I'll discuss on the next slide. The image on the right there is an example of what the tabby looks like. It's basically just a mixture of shells and sand and water and everything that could keep the house structured. So on Kingsley Plantation, we see a lot of evidence of the African influence from Anna in the building and layout of the plantation. This is because the houses for the slaves were built in a semicircular kind of pattern around the main house, which you wouldn't typically see in an American plantation. That's definitely something that came from Africa, and Anna's influence showed that. Another example is that when the slaves died, they were buried in a circular pattern around a large oak tree, which is something that is done in African villages and West African culture. And another example is if you look at the right image on the screen, those are chicken bones that were found under the foundation of one of the slave houses, which is a belief held by many African cultures of blessing the property. So basically, African slaves were able to keep their culture and continue with their belief system due to Anna's African heritage and her running the plantation. So why is Kingsley Plantation so important? This plantation was extremely different from the other plantations that we typically see in United States history. Slaves were not treated in the same way on Kingsley Plantation that they would be on, say, a typical South Carolina plantation. The slaves at Kingsley were able to maintain their culture and have some influence on the society of the plantation, which is likely due to Anna's African culture and heritage that she allowed to continue on the plantation. The slaves were able to get together after they had finished their work and interact with each other and keep their culture really alive, such as with the burying patterns of the slaves and their food that they ate and grew. Kingsley's beliefs that slaves were able to have some power and possibly become free was also very influential and important to the time because he was one of the first people to outwardly state this, and he kind of got negative reception and got frustrated because he voiced these opinions and no one seemed to hear him. This plantation really influenced Jacksonville long term. People still go visit it and see how slaves lived so long ago and really get a chance to see history firsthand in Jacksonville. And Kingsley's family, although he and his wife left Jacksonville, his family still had power for years to come and still live in Jacksonville, many of them. So he had an influence on the cultural and societal landscape of Florida forever.